stand up for this one.
Yes.
None of you sitting there. May as well fire away, since some people have been waiting half an hour.
We said to the group downstairs that we said to the group downstairs that we had 8.
Right.
Right. Is it 8?
2 minutes to
10 minutes.
2.
2. Now you're. What time? I get 10. He's got 10 off.
Well,
You get 2 off, and we have a disagreement. It's 1 off. Well, as soon as those people come in and you do have a crowd.
yeah,
Yeah, people came to.
yeah, quite amazing.
Welcome to Dr. John Languish's talk. The talk is sponsored by the Committee on Lectures and the Technology and Social Change program at Iowa State University. I'd like to apologize on behalf of the organizers for the confusion about the time. We had originally scheduled the talk for 7:30, and some announcements are given for 7:30, but the posters and the big announcements were inadvertently printed as 8 o'clock, and so we decided to wait till 8 o'clock, not to disturb some people who expect the talk to be at 8. The speaker tonight is Dr. John Langlish of the Institute of Technology of the University of Manchester in England. Dr. John Langlish is here in Iowa as a Mashua Scholar. Mashua is Mid-America State University Scholar. And Dr. Langlish is giving several talks in Ames for those of you who might be interested. His regularly scheduled seminars on Thursday afternoons at room 196 Carver at 2:10 p.m. But he will give a public lecture at the Ames Philosophical Society on Friday, the 28th of January at 4 o'clock. I don't know exactly the room, but it's a Truss Hall somewhere. Dr. John Langlish received his Bachelor's of Science degree, Master of Science degree, and Doctor's degree at the University of Manchester in England. And he is with the Department of Management and Chemical Sciences at that university. And he is director of a BSc honors course in Management and Chemical Sciences. Dr. Langlish's previous positions from 1970 to 74, Senior Research Fellow, Manchester Business School. Prior to that, he was Senior Research Fellow at the Department of Liberal Studies and Science, University of Manchester. Between 1961 and 67, with the Imperial Chemical Industries Limited at their Blakely Center, which has produced such innovations as redox, polymerization, I can't even say that correctly, but he being a chemist, he maybe can tell us about it later, and all sorts of exotic products. For the last few years, Dr. Langlish's interests have been in the field of technological innovations. He has many publications. I'll mention just the ones in book form. His best known book, perhaps to many of us, is the book on Wealth from Knowledge, Studies of Industrial Innovation, published in 1972. He has contributions in other books, The Four-Sided Triangle, Studies of the Changing Relationships Between Science and Technology in Society, and Economic Benefits of Curiosity-Oriented Research. and technological determinism. Dr. Langish has many other contributions in scholarly journals. Tonight's talk is on the subject of technology, servant, or master. Dr. Langish.
Thank you. Well, thank you for that introductory build-up. Before starting, I'd like to say thank you to the many people here who've given me such a great time, and I shall always remember Ames for its hospitality. Despite the weather that everyone's complaining about, I'm really having a great time here, and I hope that you will not be too sort of bored with some funny things that a visiting English guy might want to talk about. That's if you can even understand what I'm saying, because accents can be quite a problem, and the accent from the north of England is even more hard to understand than that peculiar accent that you associate with English people that you see on your television. I've never actually met an Englishman who talks like Englishmen on television in America. Anyway, my theme this evening is the question of whether man is free to control his own destiny. That's sort of a nice big theme, but I'm told that you're all church-going people out here and you're used to sermons with interesting sort of titles like destiny and things. So that seems a good starting point. And when I say man, I don't mean any disrespect to the feminist movement. People mean the same as man in this context. Have you ever had that feeling that you weren't quite in control of events? Have you ever said you can't beat the system? Did you feel you were actually free to make a real choice when you recently participated in the election of a new president? I want to try and show that free will is limited and that you don't have as much free will as you think you have. Americans, probably more than anybody, have this great belief that man controls his own destiny, and I'd like to try and argue the opposite. Now, one thing that firmly restricts man's free will and man's choice is the nature of man's technology. This view is known as technological determinism, which means technology determines or causes the forms of everything else. Now, at first sight, it seems a mighty crazy point of view, and you might think to yourself, well, if technology determines society in England, that's probably why they're in such a mess. But America is different, and in God's own country, we're free to change our technology if we want to. Anyone can set up in business, anyone can invent things, anyone can work through the democratic process to try and control some of the harmful side effects of technology. So what's all this technological determinism nonsense? Well, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the amount of control that we have over our technology, which we did create ourselves, is rather limited. And the first point here is that creating something is not the same as controlling it. So we might have made our own technology ourselves, but having made it, it's not at all clear who's in control. This is a very old point of view. It goes back at least as long as 1817, when Mary Shelley wrote a famous novel called Frankenstein. And the subtitle of Frankenstein was The Modern Prometheus. And you might remember that Prometheus was the guy who got punished by the gods for giving the gift of fire to man. Now, Frankenstein, a lot of people forget, Frankenstein is the name of the chap who made the monster, not the name of the monster. But the monster that was created by Count Frankenstein took over, and even took over the name of his creator. So if you ask your kids what they know about Frankenstein, they'll say Frankenstein's a monster, probably played by Boris Karloff or somebody like that, and not the chap who did the inventing. And I want to argue that new technology can acquire a life of its own and take over, something like Frankenstein's monster took over. Now you might say that is a load of European nonsense, or something stronger than that. You can't tell me that tractors are ruling people. It might make a nice science fiction story, but come off it. Technology in no way is in control. Well, I'd like to give an example of how a change in technology completely altered the nature of society for about 1,000 years. And we can take an example from an American historian, Lynn White, just to show it's not all European rubbish. And Lynn White, the American historian, claims that the feudal system was caused by one invention. Now, you know about the feudal system, that's knights and castles and all that. What single invention could possibly be responsible for causing the feudal system? Well, at this point I should show some slides to give you a clue to this question, but my slides are back home. So I'd like you, if you don't mind, to try an experiment of having some imaginary slides whereby you produce them in your own mind. So slide 1, which we haven't got, but you've got a picture for yourselves. Slide 1 is a picture of the Roman army of old. Now, I'm sure you've all seen Roman soldiers on TV or cinema, or do you call it movies? I'm not sure. But slide 1, picture of Roman army. You got that? Right. Slide 2 is a picture of a rather rough gang of people, Genghis Khan and his cutthroat mob, who managed to defeat the Romans. So I want you to have a little mental picture of Genghis Khan bashing up the Romans. That's slide 2. Slide 3 is a medieval army, the sort that we had around the time of the feudal system. Again, you must have seen lots of those on TV. Now then, what's the major difference between slide 1, that's the Romans, and the other two? Well, if you'd been looking at the right slides, the difference ought to be horses, because the Roman army didn't bother about horses. It's great big thick lads with a huge sword and a shield. But Genghis Khan and the medieval army is chaps on horses. And the invention that made horses superior to the Roman soldier was a simple thing, the invention of the stirrup. Prior to the invention of the stirrup, if you'd sat on a horse and charged at anyone, you just fell off the back of the horse. Once some guy had invented a thing called the stirrup. If you sat on a horse and you charged at someone, the weight of the horse was connected to you, and there's a simple physical concept called momentum, which meant your weight and the horse's weight knocked down the Roman soldier. Now, Genghis Khan's hordes just galloped about all over the place, but when it came to get a settled civilization, somebody got to feed those horses, and those horses were fed by a system of parcelling out land in return for military service. The head guy said, look, deputy head guy, you can have that field over there, but when I light this bonfire, you've got to come galloping up with those horses, and you've got to have some guys all kitted out with gear who can sit on them and all that. And the guys who sat on the horses became the knights. They were the top guys in society. And you can examine many aspects of the feudal society and see that the whole point of the feudal society was to make sure there were enough horses around to protect that society from being bashed up. Now, the point here is not just that technology can change society, but that man has no choice. You see, there could have been some tribes around who said, we don't like horses, nasty smelly things. And so, okay, some strange guys have invented stirrups, we don't want to know, we've got free will. No horses, no stirrups, thank you very much. Now, all that happened to that tribe was he got bashed up by the first tribe that came along who'd got horses. And in fact, people had to either change their society so as to accommodate horses, or get taken over by the guys who had the horses. It sounds a bit far-fetched. Okay, let's come a bit nearer to modern times. A classic example of technology changing society is the factory system. Factories, new way of making things. Factories only work if you've got capital, that's money, to pay for them. You've got power to make them work, and you have division of labour to separate out the tasks in the factory. And it's pretty obvious that the factory system changed society from the previous sort of society, and it's also, if you think about it, might be clear that people did not have any choice. If you were an old English cottage weaver, you had a little loom on the top of your house and you wove a bit of cloth when you felt like it. And if somebody came along and built a factory at the bottom of your road, you said, I'm not going to work in that factory. It's much more fun weaving away in my attic. You didn't have any choice because the factory made cloth cheaper. No one would buy his cloth from the top of his attic. And even if he tried to burn down the factory, it wouldn't get him anywhere because some other country would get factories and a factory-based army would come along. And the old-fashioned weaver had got no choice at all. He either starved or went to work in the factory. Now, more philosophically minded people about this point, if I'm talking to them in private conversation, tend to say something like, hang about a minute. You use technology to mean a stirrup or a factory. Now that's a bit embracing. What do you mean by technology anyway? No. I'm using technology to mean a way of doing something. It can be a way of transport, of getting from A to B. It can be a way of growing food. It can be a way of making bread. Another way of describing technology is to say technology is something that improves man's capabilities. Man on his own is a pretty puny sort of animal, but equipped with technology, it can do all sorts of strange things. Technology makes man stronger, faster, healthier, and so on. And this is precisely the point about technology. Because technology improves man's capabilities, that's why we don't have any choice. If one group of people becomes stronger than another group of people through having a superior technology, the second group of people is forced to acquire that technology. And if it's got to alter the forms of its society to fit in with the needs of this technology, it's got no choice. It either becomes a different society, or it gets taken over by the people whose capabilities have been improved by the technology to the stage where they are superior in terms of competition. Now, there are some people around who believe the exact opposite of technological determinism. Far from agreeing that technology determines the form of society, there are those people who think that a particular form of society decides what sort of technology it's got. Those sort of people think that the way to change society is through having a revolution. And if you don't like the technology, I say, if there are certain aspects of American technology that you don't like, according to this point of view, American technology is the product of American profit-oriented capitalism, and if you don't like that, the only thing you can do is have a revolution and get rid of it. Now, I don't agree with that point of view at all, and I would cite the case of Russia to indicate that exactly the opposite is the real position. Following the revolution in Russia, you've got a society that was supposed to be founded on non-profit principles and sharing things out for the benefit of the workers and so on. I've done my homework. I've read, say, Lenin's State and Revolution, which describes some aspects of the sort of society that Lenin would like to have brought about. But the Soviet Union didn't get anywhere near achieving the sort of society it apparently wanted. The reason for this is it was in competition with other countries, and the other countries had a superior form of technology. And if Russia was to defend itself from attack by white Russians, aided by Americans, French, Brits, and all sorts of other people, it had to be able to defend itself, and it had to acquire the technology that enabled to defend itself. In the process of defending itself, Russia, in fact, became a capitalist state because modern technology is based on large factories, and large factories need the accumulation of capital. So, Russia had to become the sort of society that went in for capital accumulation in order to get the factories, in order to supply the army and the food and everything else to compete with people that it saw as its enemies. And modern revolutionaries who think that techniques like work study, for example, are products of a grasping profit motive and nasty capitalist societies should remember that Lenin himself was responsible for introducing the techniques of work study into the Soviet Union. And he did that because he could see the Soviet Union had to have an efficient technology. And if that meant getting work study around and going in for the division of labour and the alienation of the workers and all the things that's supposed to be due to nasty capitalism, Russia didn't have any choice. They, in effect, adopted the forms of technology pioneered in the States and elsewhere and changed their society to fit in with that sort of approach. So, we've got to the point where we can say technology equals increased power. And societies in competition have to keep up with the power. If this technology needs a certain kind of society to keep it going, then you get that society, and there isn't any choice about it. Now, next objection to this rather pessimistic way of looking at things is to say, hey, you keep talking about technology as though it has a life of its own. Now, this is nonsense. New technology is produced by human beings. Human beings have free will, so they can decide what new technology to introduce, what new technology to invent, and so on. So, to consider this point, we've got to ask the question, where, in fact, does new technology come from? What is the mechanism that produces strange things like factories, electric power, polymers, and any other new technology that you might think of? Where does this new strange force that improves man's capability appear on the scene from? And is it a product of man's free will or some other process? Now, there are various traditional answers as to where does new technology come from. One of these is that new technology comes from science. And science is supposed to be a product of the highest sort of man's intellect and all that. So, if technology did come from science, you might think man was in control of the process. However, there's a lot of evidence that technology doesn't come from science at all. And I once offered a monetary prize back in England for a single example, just one example, of something that the chemical industry had used that had come out of chemistry developed in universities since the end of the Second World War. That's quite a long time ago. And although I was nearly physically assaulted by a professor of chemistry, nobody actually claimed this prize, and that's just for one example. a lot of things come about by technology doing its own thing. The catalysts that the petrochemical industry is based upon, for example, are the product of random empirical research, not the product of scientific understanding. If you've got a chemical reaction and you want it to go more efficiently, you work through the entire periodic table, the list of elements, and you put in a bit of this and a bit of that, and one day you find something makes it work better. It's not a product of science. Another view of where new technology comes from is a slightly older view that says new technology comes from great inventors, in capital letters and flashing lights. And this is the sort of view that is certainly in Europe still fed to our kids through the medium of books with titles like The Wonder Encyclopedia of Astounding Science and things like that, where you get little pictures of marvellous things and pictures of a guy who was the inventor. So it's rather interesting that the guy who's supposed to be the inventor is different in different countries. In an English encyclopedia, if you see a picture of a television set, it will have a picture of a Scotsman called Logie Baird next to it, and all English kids know that Logie Baird invented the television set, but not a single American kid knows that, because I'm quite sure that in America you've got some different guy who invented the television set. In the English books it says penicillin was invented by a guy called Fleming, and you can go through a whole list. Very often these chaps on investigation turn out not to have had anything to do with it at all, but the sort of literary culture demands that we find a guy responsible for inventing things. And this really goes back to a strange Victorian Englishman called Samuel Smiles, who wrote biographies of eminent Victorian engineers. But he would only write biographies of people who'd had to struggle. And if he'd got someone who'd spent 20 years living in what was called a garret, starving, before his invention had actually got round to being used, he would write up their life story. And this was purchased by the Victorians in large quantities because they went in for what was known as improving literature, which you were allowed to read on Sundays. And it seemed quite nice sort of improving stuff to read about guys struggling in garrets before their invention was actually noticed and approved of. In other words, if you work hard, you may make some money at the end of it, but it's not naughty making money because you've had to work hard and starve for 20 years. Now, there are lots of other inventors who actually did die of starvation that Samuel Smiles doesn't write about, and there were some inventors who made a lot of money without any effort at all, and he didn't write about them either. But he set the pattern for this concept of the struggling inventor. In fact, if you look carefully at invention, you find that most inventions are never used at all. The patent literature is full of patented novelties that no one's ever used. And invention, in fact, is very easy. It's quite possible to take a group of graduate students and, as an exercise in an afternoon, come up with something that's sufficiently novel for it to be patentable. Novelty is a cinch. But most inventions are not used because they don't have any advantage over other ways of doing the same sort of thing. And you can compare invention with the mutation of the genes in biological evolution. Now, mutation of the genes in the survival of the fittest has apparently produced something as incredibly complicated as man, without much in the way of free will going along the line. Nobody asked the dinosaurs if they wanted to be extinct, and nobody asked early man if he wanted to evolve into later man, and so on. It does rather seem like a strange, odd sort of mechanistic process. And by analogy, it's possible to imagine technology evolving in this strange sort of way without any intervention of human will. All you have to postulate is that inventions occur randomly in very large numbers by a crazy mechanism, because inventors are just crazy people who rush around inventing things all the time, and that perhaps only 1 in 100,000 inventions are any use to anybody, but the odd invention that is any use increases the power or capability of the people who've got it in such a way that other people have to copy it. And this idea of an invention having an advantage over other inventions is an important one, because otherwise you get stuck in strange arguments. Like, some people say, well, I don't believe in technological determinism because the Greeks invented steam, but they decided not to use it. Now, it's certainly true that the ancient Greeks actually had a primitive form of steam engine, which was capable of raising up the gates of a particular temple and frightening the natives a bit scared stiff with the apparent power of the god who could move these gates around without anyone touching them. And this was operated by a little steam engine down in the basement under the temple. And you might think the fact that the Greeks didn't use this for manufacture shows that they got some free will. Now, my interpretation of this is to say the Greeks had an awful lot of slaves. They did not have any sophisticated metal technology. They could not, in fact, have used their steam engine as the basis of the factory, and they didn't need factories, they'd got slaves. So that invention, in fact, just didn't survive because it didn't convey any advantage. It did not extend the capability of the guys running the Greek states because they'd got all the slaves that they needed, and if some American from doing a time-travelling trip had rushed in and offered to build factories for them, they could have said, go away, we don't need factories, we've got slaves, and slaves are a much more pleasant way of doing things than factories. So, it might be that man's got a little bit of free will regarding his science and his inventions, but a lot of technological change does seem to occur by some sort of strange random process, and man doesn't seem to have much free will regarding the use of inventions. If man discovers something that conveys an advantage, it's going to get used, otherwise not. Now, free will still keeps fighting back, and it's possible to say, just a moment, this advantage system that you're talking about, that decides whether inventions get used or not, that advantage system is itself controllable by man. And at first glance, this seems a reasonable thing to say. And there are some examples that you can give that show how man controls his technology by adjusting the advantage. You need rubber, and you don't want to rely on rubber from trees when you don't own the trees yourself. So the Germans decided in the 30s they wanted synthetic rubber. And they were able to do this by altering the advantage system, in that they simply put a tax on imports of natural rubber to make natural rubber more expensive than synthetic rubber. So the German industry, thinking it was exercising its free will, decided to use synthetic rubber because it was cheaper. And you might even talk about Iowa coal. Which appears to be a rather odd sort of stuff from the bit of Iowa coal that I've seen. It doesn't look anything like I recognise as coal. But it would have an advantage if the government decided to increase the price of natural gas. We'd have to increase it quite a bit. But you can see there's at some stage where Iowa coal would become economic and would be used again, and man apparently has some degree of free will about that. Take putting a man on the moon. It looks as though there's a bit of free will going there. Man got on the moon because President Kennedy decided that he would give the US of A some advantage over Russia to get a man on the moon, and so it was done. because the government apparently alters the advantage system. So, I'm prepared to concede that a little tiny bit of free will creeps in there, but it is in fact only a tiny bit. This apparent intrusion of free will is governed by severe limits. And I can still claim that free will does not extend as far as going against the demands of what I call the ruling form of technology. So what's this ruling form of technology? Well, it's something basic that affects nearly all manufacturing industry. The factory system was an example of such a ruling form. And when you get a change in the ruling form of technology, you get some really major technological changes taking place. In order to get a factory system to work, had some really big changes in technology that enabled technology to go from man-powered to machine-powered. You take paper making, for example. Before the age of the factory, paper making consisted of men holding funny frames and going shake, 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 shake in a sort of sludgy mass, shaking the water out and ending up with paper. When you got factories, you took the same sort of gadget, it's a frame, only you stuck it on a conveyor belt, and instead of having a man going shake, shake, you have a machine that goes shake, shake. But the technology has changed quite drastically. From that point in time, 150 years ago, technology of making paper, pretty much the same, even today, as it was then. Another example of a ruling form of technology is the use of electricity. Once electricity came along, nearly every industry had to go through some sort of change to turn itself onto electricity, and people didn't have much choice about that change. Now, sociologists have got a word that describes what I'm trying to get across here, this fundamental ruling concept bit. Sociologists call this a paradigm, which is spelled P-A-R-A-D-I-G-M, at least in England. I don't know how you spell it out here. Now, you get really interesting things happening when you get a change in the paradigm of technology, when the whole ruling thing that describes the whole of technology goes in for a change, then you get some really big things happening, and in the form of society that supports them. Now, what's the existing technological paradigm? What's the existing thing that governs what's happening in nearly all industry? And it's not a profit motive, because it governs what's happening in the Soviet Union just as much as what happens in the US of A. Now, this governing paradigm is the drive for economies of scale. Technological change, for about the last 25 years, has been a series of changes directed towards making the scale of nearly everything bigger. Whether you're talking about a factory that makes beer, or a steel mill, or the capacity of a tractor, or the size of an Iowa farm, they've all been getting bigger. And they've been getting bigger because there's something called economies of scale, which almost guarantees that if you do something larger, you get lower production costs. And lower production costs convey an enormous advantage. And people who are operating on a small scale just can't compete because their costs of production are going to be higher. So they've either got to get with the large technology or not compete. Now, there's quite a lot of evidence that's being gathered around at the moment to suggest that this paradigm that's really controlled our technology and our society for the last 25 years is about to break down. And it has really controlled our society, you know, because if things get bigger and more efficient, you're producing more, and if you're producing more, you've got to consume more. So in order to have the advantage of this cheaper, larger scale technology, American society has had to become the consumer society, with planned obsolescence, the waste makers and all that bit, which is necessary to get the benefits of large-scale production. But the whole thing is beginning to break down for a variety of reasons, some of which are associated with the oil crisis, some of which are associated with the coming to the end of sustained growth, and a variety of other reasons. And there is some evidence that about every 30 years or so, in fact, we do get major changes, and I think we're in for another one. And in between major periods of change, when this paradigm breaks down, there are stable periods of minor change and development. And during these stable periods, like the last 25 years, there's not much free will around. It's been almost impossible to do anything new in the way of technology in the last 25 years. If you developed a new synthetic fibre, for example, nobody would want to know, because we've got synthetic fibres already, and they're made on a very, very large scale. So if some chemist came along and invented a new synthetic fibre different from the ones we've got now, he couldn't even get it into production, because you can't go from a zero production to 1 million tonnes a year production in one go. In Britain, we've spent a lot of money on a strange thing called the hovercraft, which is a new form of transport, a new way of getting from A to B, which manages to go over both land and sea, and is lots of fun. But it doesn't actually make any money for anybody. 4 firms have gone bankrupt trying to develop this thing, despite massive assistance from the government, because it doesn't have any advantage over existing forms of transport. If you want to get from A to B, there are better and cheaper ways of getting there than there is by jumping on a hovercraft. And it's been very, very difficult indeed to do anything really new the last 25 years. And we've been stuck with the sort of technology we've got and the sort of society that's necessary to keep this technology going. Now, it's just possible that if this paradigm's breaking down and losing its advantage, the possibilities for the future then become enormous. And despite everything I've said up to now, I believe we really have to act as though we do have free will, to try and tackle the problems of the world. And we might have the chance to do this in the next few years. Because when a ruling form of technology breaks down, you've then got a certain period where alternatives are available. But once a new form of technology comes in and gets established, the choice disappears again, because an established form of technology has one incredible advantage, the fact that it's established. And it's much more difficult to come along and say, don't like that form of technology because it makes life boring for workers, or because it allows people to starve somewhere else in the world, or any other reason you can think for not liking it. Very difficult to actually change it, except at these odd points when things seem to burst open a bit. And so, in the next few years, some new technology is going to emerge. There's no reason at all why the ways that we've gone around making things for the last 30 years should last any longer. They never have done in the past. Chemical industry used to be based on coal. Before that it was based on wood. We've continually altered the source of power that our industry has used. There's no reason why that shouldn't be altered again. So, technology is going to change. And I'd like us to make every effort to ensure that perhaps maybe for the first time in history, this new technology that we do get will be man's servant rather than man's master. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Langers. I did notice an interesting thing, that Dr. Langers made a remark about the Iowa coal, and Dean Zaffarano smiled. Had an Egyptian made such a remark, he would have been physically assaulted. And worse yet, he would have been fired. But you Englishmen have I'm sure Dr. Langish will give you a chance to catch your breath, maybe get a drink of water, which is non-existent. But you wouldn't mind answering two
No,
or
I'd
three
love
or
to,
10
sure.
questions? We're not going to let this Englishman come here and insult our Iowa coal and get away with it, are we? Well, I guess we will.
When you mentioned that new things aren't being produced now, because the things that you mentioned had no advantage, like the craft that we can already do. What about things such as the factory system in Sweden, where the Volvo plants changed their methods because
Yeah.
it's improved their production?
Yeah, the Volvo experiment's quite an interesting thing, but it's actually only a very slight tinkering with the system. The Swedes have come to the conclusion that Henry Ford's invention of the assembly line system has perhaps outlived its usefulness, because working on an assembly line is an incredibly boring job, and an increasing number of workers throughout the world are saying, we're not going to do this sort of work. We either want a lot more money, or we're going to go on strike, or we're going to sabotage the line, or something. And the Swedes, being a fairly progressive sort of society, have actually tried to improve the social conditions of the assembly line. But shouldn't read too much into that. It's not really very different, the Volvo experiment. It's still an assembly line, and it's still pretty boring. It means perhaps that a guy does 4 jobs a day instead of 1. But for an intelligent person to do nothing but 4 dull, repetitive tasks during the day is still a bit of an insult. And that in no way offends the ruling paradigm that bigger is cheaper and so on. You see, if you were talking about a really new way of making cars, not a tinkering thing like the Volvo, you'd have to have something like a system which was designed for human beings, instead of trying to design human beings for the technology. And there is a way of making at least car bodies that's designed for humans instead of the other way around. This involves having moulds that are made out of cardboard instead of steel, and pouring in coal-set urethane plastic to make a one-off car mould that would last, a car body that would last about 20 years. Now you could do this in every town. You could have a little place that made car bodies, and you could wander in and have a cup of tea with the guy and decide what your specific design for car body was going to be like. You could have an individually designed car body that was yours, and it could be the maddest, craziest thing that anyone had ever thought of, in any old colour, in any old shape. And he could sit around and bring in the artist and say, this is Fred, meet Jim, and he's going to draw your car for you, pleased to meet you, and all that. And he'd get out and cut his bits of cardboard up and make the mould, and he'd see the guy he was going to make it for, and it might take him a couple of days to do it, and at the end of that, you'd have a car body that lasts 20 years. That's what I call a real technological change. Volvo experiment is just tinkering.
After society has little effect on technology, then why do some countries seem to enjoy so much more technology than others?
Why do some countries have so much more technology than others? Because they've got a lot more in the way of natural resources. If you start out with a lot of natural resources, you can't help making money. Once you start making money, you can accumulate some of the profits of that money, and if you've got money, it makes money. The more money you make, the more you've got to invest. The more you can invest, the larger scale and more capital intensive your industry can be. The more capital intensive it is, the more the profits, because your price is lower than other people's price because of economies of scale. Until you get to the day when you've got one factory that can supply the entire needs of the United States with your product, and then you get stuck. And that sort of thing is already happening in Europe. We have a factory in England that makes enough styrene to supply the entire needs of England twice over. And when we built that, we thought we'd export half. But the other side of the channel, the Germans have done the same thing. They've got a factory, make twice the needs of the Germans for styrene. And we export styrene from Germany to England and back again in both directions, competing by price cutting. And there comes a stage when this enormous economic growth and the edifice that's created around it must crumble. When that happens, the United States of America, instead of being the top country in the world, is going to be one of the bottom countries in the world, because you're so stuck with your way of making things on the large scale in factories and so on that you're going to have problems. That's why, of course, Iowa's so interesting, because Iowa's one of the few parts of the states, as far as I can gather, where you haven't really gone over completely to large-scale technology yet. And there seem to be some very interesting small firms around Iowa doing nice, interesting things on a human scale. And you never know, Iowa might end up being the top state of the United States if small-scale technology becomes the thing of the future.
I guess we have a thing or two to teach this Englishman. Tell him we are the top state in the world.
Sorry, yeah.
There's a Dr. Tarrant back there. I don't have my glasses. No, yes. Didn't you raise your hand a while ago? I better put.
I'd like to ask where free will ends. And oddly enough, it seems strange that an Englishman is going to defend our call against another Englishman. But in fact, there are 1 billion tons of coal lying beneath the Iowa surface, and we import 98% of our power into Iowa. But really, it is the free will of the federal government that is stopping us mining that coal. It goes back to the Salter continent. I think also they are imposing limitations upon nuclear power plants, which we have no control over. So, I mean, where does free will start and where does it end? Does it start with the individual, the legislature of the state, or in fact the federal government?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. I tried to say that there's a strange thing called the advantage system that decides whether some technology gets used or not. And it only gets used if it's got an advantage over other ways of doing things. And it does seem as though governments have a certain restricted ability to control the advantage system. If they, for some reason, decide they don't like some form of technology because of its side effects, they can pass laws restricting its use, like the quality of emission of gases into the atmosphere and the sulfur content. They can control the price of certain things and in that way alter the advantage system, but only within very narrow limits, that a government can only get away with what the people will let it do. And from the point of view of a European, the actual amount of choice that you've got in the selection of your government in the States seems pretty small. We Europeans just couldn't see much difference between Carter and Ford. They were different sorts of people, sure, but we're used to the concept of an election based on the choice of policies, not people. And there's no European commentator could actually say what Carter would do if he became president that was going to be different from what Ford would do. So you weren't actually voting for discrete choices that might affect whether Iowa coal was more expensive or not. In effect, I suppose you put a hunch on that sort of guy is your sort of guy and he'll do the things you want. I must confess I don't understand American presidential elections at all. But it doesn't look like an exercise of free will from the point of view of a European.
I should like to add that I have no say whatever in who state or this country. I need not operate in politics.
Adrian?
Do you have any view on what China's doing with small-scale technology, rural industrialization?
Yeah, the case of China is extremely fascinating because it rather looked as though China was going to be the odd one out that disproved my contention that there was one ruling form of technology that everyone had to copy. And the Chinese appeared to be going for small-scale village technology that was different in kind from the large-scale industry adopted by Russia and nearly every other country that could afford it. But my friends who are Chinese watchers, who read the Chinese newspapers and so on, indicate that it looks as though the present struggle in China is going away from the small-scale technology movement. And I could be quite wrong on this, nobody's quite sure, but it's at least possible that the people winning control in China at the moment are going to be people who are in favour of more efficiency, and more efficiency to them is going to mean larger technology and getting friendly with America as a way of keeping out the Russians. And it might be we've seen the end of the Cultural Revolution. Nobody's prepared to admit that yet. But if the people in favour of village-based technology are going to win the day in China, they've got to show that it has some advantage over large factories, and that in terms of using resources, it is actually efficient. Not in terms of making a profit, but China, like any other country, has got scarce resources, and they've really got to demonstrate that small scale is a better way of using their resources than large scale. And I don't think they've made up their minds on that yet.
Buckley?
I was wondering about this, the supersonic airplane. You were talking about
Sure.
the advantages, and what do you see there?
Well, it's silliness. The Concorde aeroplane is a classic example of an invention that isn't any use to anybody. It's the British government and the French governments have spent an enormous amount of money producing this aeroplane, and every one of it that they actually sell, not that they've really been able to sell any yet, the more they sell, the more money they will lose, because the selling price itself is subsidised. That's quite ignoring the, what would it be, $2,000 million spent in the development of it. Just the actual production costs themselves, ignoring that expenditure, are subsidised. For what purpose? Madness. It's to do with the fact that the Brits and the French have a bit of a myth about technological change, which is that the Europeans are great at inventing things, but it's rotten Americans that dash off and develop their inventions and use them and make money out of them. So with the Concorde and the hovercraft, it was official government policy that this time we're not going to let the Americans get away with it first. Which is very silly.
You started a section on the development of industry on the basis that the country had to have some natural resources. Of course, I quarrel with you in terms of Japan, which has a very fine technological industry without resources, natural resources, like I can see. But the other country is England. I'm wondering about the recent finding of oil and gas in the North Sea. You would visualize as having a profound impact on technology in England in terms of new resources come in that wasn't really expected a decade ago, and with this resource, a new wave of industry should develop. Is it possible?
Oh, I shouldn't think we'd want to do anything as energetic as getting a new wave of industry going, no. We were the first country to have an industrial revolution, and we've rather got a bit sort of bored with industry in England, and nobody wants to work in it. The ambition of every bright young lad is to get as far away from the actual manufacturing operation as possible. Be an accountant, be a lawyer, be a doctor, work in the English civil service, work in a university, do almost anything than actually work in manufacturing industry. So we've got a problem, but we've got some problems that the rest of the world haven't faced yet because we were the first country to start manufacturing. And one of the problems that we've tackled longer than anybody else is how do you give the workers in an industry some sort of feeling of getting along with that industry and not just regarding them as extensions of the machine. The industrial workers in Britain have lived in cities and worked in factories longer than any other group of industrial workers anywhere. In France and Italy and lots of other countries, they're still pouring in out of the countryside. German industries kept going by something like 2 million imported foreign agricultural workers. Look, the British industrial worker's been unionised longer and has lived in cities longer than anybody else. And he's not going to stand for any old rubbish from management, and he knows about going on strikes and things like that. So we've had to evolve a system which is a bit less efficient, but does allow some place for the human being. And I would like to see our society developing more in the direction of working out technologies that allow human beings to enjoy themselves, rather than force human beings to rush around being energetic, competitive, and efficient. To what end do we wish to be energetic, competitive, and efficient? It's much more fun being an Englishman and taking 3 hours off for lunch.
That's how we go about it.
Did you?
Wilson had a question.
Yeah, it seemed to me that several of your questions, or answers to the questions, demonstrated that there was a considerable amount of free will involved. It seems to me from the various things you said that although some technologies are advantageous, that they're not automatically and obviously advantageous, that somebody has to decide which one is and is not. And the hovercraft and the Concorde represents examples where people have apparently made the wrong decision. Whereas in the case of the stirrup, it's Charles Martel's decision, according to Lynn White, that develops that into an advantageous technology. That is not obviously an advantageous technology. Somebody has to decide.
Yeah, I think it's more random than that. I think that whoever it was is accredited with inventing the stirrup. It doesn't make much difference. It's a pretty sensible...
Well, he didn't invent it.
Yeah.
He invented the feudal system
Okay.
around the stirrup.
Yeah. But I mean, it would have happened anyway. It's a pretty obvious sort of thing. Once you've got the stirrup and you want a settled sort of society, you've got to have some way of keeping the horses going.
Well, then it seems to me that it's a circular argument when you say it would have happened anyway, because then what you're saying is that everything that has happened has to have happened.
No, because there's such a thing as alternative technologies. What had to happen was that there
Who
was...
chooses the alternatives?
No, it's just random, you see. Look, once you've got the stirrup, if you want to have a settled down community and stop being Genghis Khan rushing about the place, picking up the food as you gallop along, if you want to settle down, you've got to feed the horses. Now, there are all sorts of different ways that people might have found of feeding the horses. They needn't have evolved the feudal system, they could have evolved some other system. But once some guy had got some system that actually worked, then you're stuck with that. But which system you got is almost a matter of chance.
This gentleman here, we'll take 2 more questions and we'll quit. This gentleman back there. Yeah.
I have a feeling, listening to some of your answers, that in a sense, you are tending to limit your definition of technology to the structural relationships of physical objects, rather than perhaps also add in the structural relations of social organization, such as the difference between the way that the Chinese organize their society, or the Japanese organize theirs, or the Americans ours. Chinese can do things that we can't simply because we have different social structural organization. Would you comment on that?
Yeah, you're right. That's, I define technology in terms that it includes some hardware, and this causes communication problems when I'm talking to a sociologist. It's one of the facts of life, and you've got to realise that if ever you talk to people with a scientific or engineering background, they're going to see technology as having a hardware component. And you can talk about social systems all you like to people from an engineering background, and they're not going to hear a word you say, because that's one of those things between sociologists and the rest of the world. They don't communicate.
Looks like I'd like to eat my words. This lady here first, and Dr. Duque, then
I wondered if you'd had an opportunity to see much of the technology in household technology in the United States. It isn't as ridiculous as Jacques Marti's movies, but it has its points. They're called labor-saving devices, and they end up with women and children who used to know what to do to keep themselves busy without much to do and not knowing exactly what to do with their time. And except the machinery breaks down and wears out, have you had a chance to see what we use, not just what they try to sell you on television?
No, I've watched some adverts and you've obviously got some interesting gadgets. I mean, the theory of this is that industry has got to sell to stay going, and it persuades people to keep buying, and in the process changes society, either for good or bad, but purely randomly. If labour-saving gadgets enable more ladies to get away from the home and go back to university and study things or go to work and so on, if to that extent it liberates them, then it's good. And if it makes them sit at home feeling sad, it's bad. But no one designs the technology to make ladies feel either good or bad. It's designed to sell.
Dr. Booth.
The rate of patenting per number of population has been decreasing in the United States. I don't know whether that phenomenon is all over the world, but how do you view this? Is this